Welcome to Middle Fingers Up. I'm your host, Kieran. Today, I'm so excited. I get to sit down with Astha Soni. She is a mental health advocate. She is an aspiring physician. She's a writer. You need to check out her blog, and she'll talk about that today. She comes in with a degree in human development and psychology. And through her leadership in her university and her time going to school, she spent some time building some mental health initiatives and community organizations that she worked for to help bridge that gap we keep finding ourselves in between the Western and the Eastern mental health supports. And this is really exciting because you guys know I've worked all my career in mental health, and it's so refreshing to meet young people in our community that are starting to recognize early that we have a lot of work to do in helping address the institutionalized approach when it comes to mental health supports. And I think folks like Astha are really, really trying to highlight this, bring it to the surface, especially coming right out of school. So I'm so excited to have someone at her place, at her pace, to be able to do some of this work that someone like me wasn't really getting it and really got sucked into the Western colonization kind of way of running some of these mental health facilities. So excited to have her in the field to push back, challenge some of the weird ass ways that white folks think we need services. And it's time for us to start to ask more of, why are you telling me this instead of asking me? So let's welcome Astha. Welcome to the podcast. Let's get into it. How you doing?
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this.
Yes, so am I. You know, you're one of those wonderful people that when at the end of the episodes we say these conversations are door openers, which is what they are. We're just starting these conversations. Reach out. We want everyone to be part of this. This is our platform. And I appreciate this because you are one of those people that reached out and said, I have an idea. I want to do my episode. And that's really what this is. It's not my platform. It's ours. And I'm really appreciative of the way that we are building this community. We're not from the same country. You're in the States. I'm in Canada. And here we are sitting, side by side or across from each other, talking about the things that I think we all can step up and work on in our community. So I'm excited to learn from you. And do you want to just jump right in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's do it. So let's start with you. So I want to know about little Astha. So what was growing up like for you in home when it comes to learning about mental health, learning about ways that our well-being was addressed? What do you remember being taught as a kid?
Yeah, well, I guess for some context, so I was actually born in India and I immigrated to the States like at the age of 2. But I remember my parents had moved here before I did. So I actually spent the first 2 years of my life living with my dada-dadi, which are my grandparents. And so from a really young age, I think I was very culturally aware. And the whole immigration process and just being very in touch with like my Indian culture and my South Asian side was really difficult, I think, initially when I was growing up, being thrown into a school with a bunch of white kids when I only knew how to speak Hindi and Punjabi. So that was a really big adjustment, I think. And then in terms of mental health, like I just remember, obviously at that age, at like a younger age, I didn't really know the terms of mental health, but I know that it was very like blanketly expressed. I think it was like happy, sad. And if you were sad, it was something that needed to be like band-aided right away. Like I remember like if I would ever feel sad about something, or I remember adjusting to school was really hard, and kind of telling my parents about that and talking to them. And it was almost like, okay, what can we do to fix it? And it wasn't really like I wasn't held space to feel sad. I think it was something that needed to be fixed right away kind of thing. And so growing up, that's kind of always what I thought about negative feelings or mental health in general, is it was something that needed to be fixed right away, and that we couldn't really hold space for those negative feelings.
Mm-hmm. Where do you think that comes from? Because I think that's probably a lot of people listening or viewing today can relate to that energy in our households. Our parents, our grandparents do not want to see us upset. Where do you think that whole fix-it mentality kind of came from?
I think I saw it the most in my dad. And I know it came from a place of love. Like, obviously, no grandparents wants to see their child upset. And so whenever these like negative feelings arrive, kind of the only thing that they resort to is, okay, well, how can I make her feel better? Or how can I make these feelings go away for them? And obviously that comes out of a place of love. But I think the initial reaction that they would always have is fix it and make it go away. And I think that a lot of it comes from like just the Indian like working mentality that like everything needs to be good and functional so that you are good and functional. And, you know, productivity is a really big part of our culture because that's how our community fosters so many hardworking immigrants to come here to these countries, is by go working. And so any sort of like negative feelings are almost seen as a hindrance, I think.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, I feel like where a lot of it stemmed from is it's like, okay, well, she needs to be in a happy state of mind to be productive, to be doing things on her own, like to be emotionally competent, I think was really important for our community.
That's really well said. And I've been doing a little bit of looking into, you know, sometimes we grow up with these sort of stereotypes and sayings, and this whole, our parents want us to be doctors, lawyers, engineers. That's always like a ha-ha joke at the reception parties as cousins, right? We're like, oh, I picked mental health. And one's like, I'm an artist. We're like, oh no. But I've been wondering a lot of like, where is that coming from? Because a lot of times growing up, we blamed our own community for wanting to build that status, driving the fancy cars and the big houses, and like getting upset with each other. And the more I started reading and looking into it, I can't believe I didn't even know this, but I learned a lot about the model minority and the way a lot of the communities in the States and in Canada were brought in was this model minority approach of let's go find the best doctors and the best people that with careers and let them immigrate here, and then those are the immigrants that we want. And so my grandfather was one of those, and so a lot of people that came in, there was a status that they felt that they had to uphold. And it makes so much sense when you say, when we come from this productive sort of background, colonization can be blamed for that, but it makes sense why our parents thought, okay, in order for our kid to also be that model minority and continue, then we have to make sure they have to be happy and they have to be in this good state. And overall, that's a kind message. But I hear you when we need the space to be able to feel all the feelings, because a lot of young people don't get to grow up with all the feelings that we are going to experience, whether we love it or not, as we get older. So I think you made a really good point with that, you know, where some of that comes from. And the more we dig into it, the more we start to see why we say the things we say and why we do the things we do. I don't know if you want to add to that or not before I ask your next one.
Yeah, as you were kind of talking, I think another thing I kind of remembered is even my dad was sharing like experiences with his father as well. And, you know, like being sad was compared to the basic necessities that they had. I think I've seen that a lot in like, it's kind of a common sentiment with a lot of immigrant children is like, oh, what do you mean you're sad? Like, we came here all the way to this country to provide for you. And, you know, you have a shelter over your head, you have food, you have water, like you live in a warm space. And so what do you mean you're sad? And I think that was another thing that my friends and I like grew up a lot hearing, was that like our feelings were also tied to those like basic necessities. But I also think as much as we saw it as a negative thing, like to our parents, it was like, we fought so hard for you to have this luxury of life. It's almost to them like you being sad is a betrayal to all the hard work they did. I think that's kind of the dichotomy of it. But not to say it didn't affect the way we thought about ourselves and our feelings growing up too, you know?
Totally. And I think a lot of guilt is sort of underlines that, because I mean, I've had white friends tell me too, like, what are you so upset about? You're so privileged. And it's like, yeah, I'll never, ever take that for granted. Trust me. I've seen my parents, I've seen my grandparents, I've seen my aunts and uncles, I've seen them have to work and survive in the way that they've had to. in the way that these white friends will never know. But at the same time, I think we do have a lot of underlying guilt, because I was saying this to a friend the other day. I'm like, I don't think I'll ever be able to be the mom that the moms in our community have been, because you live for your kids and you do all these sorts of things. And that's not necessarily how I feel I should be a mom. And so then there's guilt, because I'm like, my kids will never experience the kind of cooking my mom gave me and the kind of caretaking. But, I'm more like, grow up and take care of yourself. So I wonder sometimes about when we grow up with the messages that we get, and there's no blame here, but the messages we get still transfer through, where does that guilt go, and where does all of that understanding of some of those childhood experiences go? And I wonder for our community, because I think a lot of young people, a lot of us growing up, didn't have the language to articulate necessarily why I was feeling this way or why I was feeling that way. And so a lot of it was suppressed. And so I think there's no right or wrong. I think it's just recognizing, like, how did I get to the place that I'm at? How come I am here? Where is this guilt coming from? So what inspired you to want to like pursue psychology and mental health?
Yeah, I think in middle school is kind of when I had an interest for like talking about mental health. And I'll get into this a little later with my blog. I think like it stemmed from just starting to write like little quotes a day, or like positive messages to myself, or like just writing them in my room somewhere. And I found that either journaling or writing those quotes down like almost helped me like have a good day. And I was like, wow, like this feeling stuff and like psychology is really important. And I think getting into high school, I remember taking like a psychology class at my high school, and I really liked it. And so it just kind of evolved from there. And I knew that was something I maybe wanted to explore more. So then when it came to applying for colleges, I was like, okay, I think I want to pursue a major in psychology.
Yeah, that's so cool. The quotes, anything you remember, or any particular sort of mantras or quotes that really helped you get through some tough times?
Honestly, they were really cheesy, and I remember back in like 2016 when Tumblr was like a really big thing. I would get a lot of my quotes from like the little emo like aesthetic Tumblr quotes, and that's what I would write on my whiteboard. And I think it literally turned into my mom taking pictures of my whiteboard quotes and posting them on Facebook for her friends to see. And so that's kind of what sparked it, is like other parents and moms were like, wow, I needed to hear this today. And it was like the smallest reminders, like be your own sunshine, or like, when the world seems dark around you, like use your own light to guide you. It was kind of things like that. And it was called Whiteboard Gems. And my mom would post like little pictures almost every day of like my whiteboard quotes. So yeah.
That's adorable. I love that your mom took that on too. And sometimes that's the thing, like cheesy, we can call it that, but they hit hard. And same way that crappy feedback hits hard. And so of course good stuff is going to happen too. And I think that's lovely that you and your mom share that. And, I had an opportunity just this past weekend. It was Women's Day this whole month. Every day should be Women's Day. And I got to be part of a really cool day. And that was sort of like the conversations where a lot of the women were just like all hungry to hear that and tell each other, because sometimes we hold back and we hold on to it and we don't get to talk in the way that I think we're really wanting to. And so it's nice to be able to open those doors. And sometimes you don't even realize you're doing it when you say something or you write that down for you. And it's like just role modeling organically in many ways. So I love that. Anything else that's kind of comes out from your childhood that links to your desire to get into mental health?
Honestly, I think I really realized the community aspect of mental health as well from a really young age. Like, I think since I was maybe 6 or 7, my mom has been really active in her community. I remember we used to own like a Indian clothing store. Like my mom owned like her own boutique. And then from there, she started doing like fashion shows. And she was one of the first people in Seattle to start hosting like Indian fashion shows in our community. And so from there, it evolved into a nonprofit for women empowerment. And now we're like an international nonprofit that serves people back in India as well as all over the US. So I think growing up and watching that progress, I really, really learned the value of community. And I didn't realize until I was older, obviously, but how much that community actually had a lot to do with mental health. And I think like my mom was one of those first people in the Washington, Seattle area to create community for Desi women, and like women that were moms and that were like had that mentality of like being a stay-at-home mom, like only providing for her family. Like these were women that were now coming to be on Seattle Fashion Week and like modeling clothes and learning the true definition of beauty and knowing that they didn't just have to serve their husbands and take care of their kids. Like they could do something for themselves. And I think like that didn't click in the moment when I was a kid, but growing up, I was like, wow, community and just empowering each other to hold that space and really be like, hey, let's uplift each other together and break cultural boundaries. That in itself is such a big step towards like our community's mental health. And so I think that was kind of where it stemmed from, but I didn't obviously realize that until later. But it was so magical to see that.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. That all of that, like I'm just sort of speechless because there's so many things going on in that. First, your mom's generation, it's not really common to be in that kind of a situation. And second, I think a lot of our women, because we have in many job places, schools, sort of been taught that there can only be one of us. And then when there's so many of us, it starts to feel like competition. But we don't realize that when we start to compare ourselves, but that's really what's happening. And this comparison shuts us down individually because I think, oh, Astha's got all this going on. I have nothing to offer. I see the polished version, not knowing really what's going on in your world and the challenges also. And I think when our women do this, there's huge change that happens. And it's a big message for the women who traditionally think this is my only path, which is taking care of the household and the things that I have to do. And some want to do it, but a lot of times that's just the way it is. You don't realize there's other options. So good work for your mom. Like huge congrats for doing something like that. And it was something that she loved. You know, sometimes we think we have to do this big grand thing, but it's like start with what you love. And that creativity is a way I feel like it just channels innocence, which channels longevity. The more we can have that in us, the longer we live. So good for her. So let's talk a little bit about your blog. You mentioned it. How did that start? And share some of the things that you have been writing about. You're an excellent writer. Very, like, so easy to read, really relatable. Well done.
Thank you. As I kind of mentioned earlier, I think I've always had a passion for writing. I just like remember as a kid, we would have like free writing time during English classes or whatever in elementary school. And I was always a really creative person, I think, especially in the writing front. I would always write like cool stories and like a lot of fantasy fiction kind of things. And from there, I evolved to writing like almost journal prompts. I've actually had a journal since I was 11 years old, and I still have it and still write in it. But that journal started off as me writing about my day. And it's funny because now looking back at it, like the things that I used to be so upset about are like so silly little things. It was like, oh, my dad took away my Kindle and I'm mad. And that's what I would write about in my journal. But then I think I kind of stuck with it because it was such a consistent part of my life, was just like writing in my journal. Yeah, I just made it a vow to myself that I was going to keep writing that. And as I grew older, now I've evolved to writing letters to myself. So at the end of each month, I'll like take a day, like the last day of the month or the first day of the month, and like write a letter to myself for that month. So I'll be like, Dear January Astha, and I'll kind of like talk about, you know, whatever was on my mind for that month. And then at the end of the year, I'll do like a whole year summary. And so that journaling really, I guess, prompted my blog, because what started off as like an outlet that was just for me, anytime I would post it or publish it, I know people would always be like, oh my God, I really needed to hear this today. Or like, wow, I really resonated with that. And it was so interesting to see how like the smallest things that maybe were just meant for me at the time clicked and resonated with so many other people. Yeah. So from there, I started my website, and then it started off as, again, just publishing those journal prompts. But then from there, I was like, okay, like these are things that clearly my peers want to or need to hear. And then it turned into writing for them and for myself.
Oh, that's amazing. I love that story. And towards the end, we'll get you to share your website so folks can go on and check it out too. What I love about that is almost every single guest that comes on, when I ask them for feedback or, apart from saying self-compassion is something we need to practice, so many talk about journaling, and I'm a fan of it too. I grew up writing. I found the other day an old book, and it was our first trip in 1994 to India, and I'd never been on a plane, and I was 14, and I sent it to my sister and brother because my brother was like 4 and he puked all over me at the Heathrow airport. And just the way that I wrote, it was so funny. Like, you think you're just, I don't know what I thought I was, but I thought I was something for sure. And the words, I was like, damn, I don't even know these words anymore. But it stuck and it stayed. And I think a lot of people would agree that writing takes what we have up here onto paper, and it also helps us see the reality of what's going on for us. Even though you're, writing about dad taking away your Kindle, if you didn't have a space to do that, because not all of us have the space to talk about it with our parents, that would have stuck in and come out in other ways. And I think it's a lovely way to get it out and see the pain, see the story, or whatever it is. And then the other thing that I love is the prompts, because then there's also the folks that want to do it but don't know where to start. And it's overwhelming to just open a blank paper and boom, go ahead and do it. So to have some little bit of a support or a caring gesture to be able to start and write in a way, I think that's lovely. And you should definitely think of going into business with selling those, because people love it. People buy the Rupee Kaur one all the time, right? I love that. I am also curious, and I've been dying to talk about this. When you and I had our consult together, we had talked about you going to school for psychology and then this time that you spent in Delhi to do some schooling. And I think it was a semester. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong with how long. So can we talk about what course you were taking, what was going on, and maybe even a little bit of like, how did you think it was going to go before you got there, and sort of what did you come out with that you didn't expect to learn, or maybe even shift? I don't know if it shifted your view and how we should approach mental health.
I think, well, the program was kind of random how I found out about it. I think I always had, as I started taking psychology classes at Davis, I was yearning for that connection of how whatever I was learning would connect to our culture and our community. And so that spawned an interest in like specifically South Asian mental health. And I was looking for programs or even professors that were doing that kind of work to be a part of. And unfortunately, I didn't find a lot, especially not at Davis or anywhere near me. But surprisingly, I found a professor that was hosting a study abroad about this topic in Alabama. So not even affiliated through my college, but in the East Coast. And I connected with him and I was like, hey, I'm not even from the University of Alabama, but I'm really passionate about this topic and I'm wondering if I can be a part of the program or get a chance to go. And he responded saying, yeah. And so it ended up happening. I went with a bunch of Alabama students actually to Delhi.
Were they all brown or were they?
So surprisingly, because it was offered through the university, it was like a broad credit that you could receive and like a psychology class credit. Okay. And so actually the people that went with me, it was only a group of 4. One of my friends who I brought from California, and he was Punjabi brown, so that worked out. And then a black girl from Alabama and another white girl.
Okay.
So
interesting, yeah.
Very interesting group of people to go with. I wouldn't have traded it for anything because I think like it was really cool getting to teach them and show them our culture while learning myself.
Yeah.
And it was interesting seeing them like react so differently to things that we think are so normal when going back home. And so the program was a month long. We stayed in Delhi and each day was almost like a different project or workshop or activity. So our lectures were never like in a lecture hall where you're sitting and being taught something. Our lectures were in real time. And we learned about different kinds of intersections and different kinds of things in Indian culture that influence someone's mental health. So, for example, I think one of the most notable things or most resonating experiences was we actually went to a bunch of temples around India or around Delhi and learned how they actually treat or cater to mental health symptoms in a religious site. So like at a mandir or at a gurdwara. And it was really interesting to learn about just, I guess, the contrast of like mental health and religion. And then a couple other things that I thought were really cool was we even learned about historical struggles of, Indian people, of our ancestors, a big one being the partition. We actually went to a really big fort in India that housed a lot of partition refugees. And from there, we learned about intergenerational trauma and how that carries on through our communities, especially within the Sikh community that was largely displaced during the partition. So it was really interesting to be in like those spaces. And we went to a lot of like touristy things as well, but it was cool to learn about these artifacts or these places that I see so often when I go back home to Delhi, but seeing them in a new light, seeing them how they related to mental health, how they affected our people for generations, and just learning about it from like an academic context versus, like, oh yeah, I've been to Lal Killa, like Red Fort, or I've been to Taj Mahal, or these kinds of things, just going with your family versus really, really taking the time to intentionally learn about those spaces.
I have so many follow-up questions. This is like phenomenal. But I want to start right at the beginning because before just as you were telling us about going on this learning journey, you mentioned you were looking for something more when you were in school. And I know it's not exactly how you say it, but that's sort of what I gathered. So when you started your schooling, you kind of don't know what to expect because you're starting psychology, you're brand new at it. So what did you already feel was not there or missing that kind of brought you to go back to home to take some of the learnings?
Davis was on a quarter system, so I'd have 3 quarters in a year, and that would mean 3 different psychology classes in 1 year, right? And so I felt like all 3 of those classes, like they would always have the same general structure, and then depending on what psych class it was, it'll alter the content a little bit, but it kind of always started off with the more biological stuff, like learning about the brain, and then it would always transition into psychological theories and like emotions, learning about that kind of stuff. But I never felt like it was conceptualized to like real people. Like when you learn about these psych theories, it's like, okay, but how does that affect a person in real time? Like I understand B.F. Skinner wrote this theory that long ago, right? But how does that really translate to real people every single day? And I remember taking this social psychology class and we learned about the psychology of emotions. And I just remember a lot of the emotions that they were talking about, a lot of the research studies that we were asked to look at for assignments were very, very Western centric. And I just didn't feel like I related to any of those things. A lot of the findings in the research studies were like, if this was replicated in India, they would have received not the same results at all. And so I was always yearning for that connection. Like I really wanted to understand what I was learning better. I was like, okay, well, how does this apply to me or anyone for that fact? And I think that's kind of where I found a really big gap in like institutionalized learning and education was it's not widely applicable and it's definitely not catered to non-Western cultures. And especially in the psychology field, I don't think I've ever, in my 4 years of being a psychology major, I don't think I ever read or saw or heard or learned about anything about how psychology or mental health impacts marginalized communities or how it reflects in Indian communities specifically. So that was kind of what led me to be like, okay, well, maybe not at Davis, but there has to be someone somewhere doing something related to our people, right? And that's kind of how I found the Alabama professor.
Yeah, I mean, you said it so honestly and accurately. That's exactly what it is like we all go to school, a mental health school and various kinds of degrees and masters and, doctorates and stuff. And everybody comes out with the same stuff. And there's a lot of this, like now that I have this under my belt, now that I'm a registered professional, I've done the ethics course, all this sort of stuff, I know better. And it's sort of this like, I can now take all of these theories and apply them to every single one, but there's so much context missing when your client is sitting across from you. So kudos to you for following that guide and seeing the gap right there, like, wait a minute. And now you get to Delhi and you do this programming and you get to go. It's so interesting. You mentioned the partition. Today is actually 14 years ago, my nanny passed away when she was visiting in India. I know. And I had a little bit of an emotional morning. Part of my guilt is my grandparents held so much history and probably so much understanding and explanations of why I am the way I am. And I never had the opportunity, never took the opportunity, didn't understand how to have that intergenerational dialogue with them. And I unfortunately learned years and years and years later that my grandma was one of the people on the train on the way to Delhi where she had to hide out in the jungle for days where they were throwing food and all. And today I just ask, like, what was that like? Because I now see so many signs that connect to her trauma. And that was one of many things I'm sure she experienced. And so for you to be there and feel it and hear it from our own community, I think it's such an asset. It's so important for us to understand that at some point when we're ready to. And I'd love to now talk to you a little bit about that. So you go down there and, you have a little group. That's awesome. You're all sort of experiencing this. For you, what were the things that were maybe hitting home that the schooling in Seattle wasn't really hitting home? So what were you getting from learning about intergenerational trauma? And I asked you this at the consult, did you guys do any programming, in North America for intergenerational trauma? And you said there was one course. And even that was like a quick, whatever. And so I want to know for you, what did you come out learning about it that some of us that go to school here don't really get?
I think one really, really, really big key thing I learned was, I think going initially before I had started the program, I was always looking to apply what I learned to there, right, to India, and see how whatever I've learned in like Western schooling applies here. And once I got there, I think you can't have a preconceived idea of what you think it's going to be, because as soon as I got there, I was like, well, all of my 4 years of psychology out the window. And I really wanted to actually just be present and have an open mind about what I was learning. And I think I realized that the more that we try and understand Indian, South Asian mental health from a Western perspective, we are going to be set up for failure. Because one of the biggest things I learned was that our mental health, emotions, like emotional competency is so rooted in culture and tradition rather than these psychological theories that we always learn about. And I think that was really, really eye-opening for me, especially when I remember we went to a masjid in Delhi that does these forms of like exorcisms. And it was mainly for people of like Islamic faith that believed in like a jinn, or like a devil, and how people would believe that they were possessed by this jinn, and they would go and see this baba or priest, and he would perform this ritual that was like what you could describe as an exorcism, but not really. It was just basically removing the jinn spirit or the black magic from that person's body. And I think when I was sitting there, I was like, wow, I don't think any psychological theory could help me understand this. But as our instructor was talking, one of the main things she mentioned was, honestly, a lot of these people are low income, not educated, and these are kind of the only outlets they can turn to when they experience like very intense mental health symptoms. And a lot of the symptoms of what she was describing that she's seen in the people that attend this masjid are patients with schizophrenia. And when you think of schizophrenia, like when we think of it, we know certain symptoms, we know like, okay, might be genetically linked, etc. But when you look at it from a context of Delhi and the people that are going to this masjid to receive those exorcisms, they genuinely think it's like black magic or it's a spirit within them. And whether you call it a spirit or you call it a mental health disorder from the DSM-5, at the end of the day, those feelings are very real and they experience the exact same mental health symptoms. They just don't know the context or the meaning of it. This is kind of what I was thinking, is maybe there's a benefit in not having to put them in a box and labeling them as schizophrenics versus these are people that are using their religion as an outlet to gain support and relief from their mental health symptoms that they might be struggling with. And I think that was probably the biggest moment I had in Delhi, because it was like, it's not that they don't know what mental health is, and it's not that they don't experience it. Every human experiences feelings and mental health struggles at least once in their life, but it's the cultural context that make their experiences so different. It was just so eye-opening to see that while they were experiencing something that the West would call like schizophrenic symptoms, they had found relief in like non-Western ways, in through religion, through talking to priests. And another thing she mentioned that I thought was so inspiring was now it's actually starting to become a practice in Delhi that priests are trained in mental health response. And so what's really cool is that people that might not be educated about what mental health symptoms they're experiencing or any mental health disorders they have, if they do go to a priest is now knowledgeable in that aspect, that they can either refer you to get medication or to see a doctor. And I think that barrier of having a priest there versus going straight to psychiatrists, which we know is so taboo in our country, was really, really beneficial for a lot of people, because they were able to receive culturally competent care without it being referred to like straight as a psychiatrist or going to therapy or something like that.
Yeah. Man, oh man, I literally just read about this, and I might be quoting it wrong, but I think it came from an old Gujarati practice. It's been around forever. And I think our community is starting to go and say, oh, we can actually recognize that this is a way to link. And, you know, whether we go to, your priest or whoever, the thing that's so interesting is that collective care. The person that might be exhibiting, if we want to call the Western way, schizophrenic episodes, they're going for support and they're asking for help and they're connecting. And a lot of times in the Western world, you hear about a lot of people with very complex mental health disorders. They isolate. The medications don't work. And what ends up happening is they get hospitalized and put in a very traumatic setting with isolation and all sorts of things that start to happen. And it's so interesting that we have these practices that, I mean, I'm going to ask you too, like, what was it like for you being sort of brainwashed with 4 years of like white norm therapy knowledge, and then going back home and sitting there and learning about that, and even your colleagues that are there, because at least you have a door opener coming from the community, but you have a couple of colleagues there that don't know our community. So for all of you sort of learning about that, was there a little hesitation at first to sort of buy in or accept that?
Yeah, I think even someone that's part of the community, I held almost an immediate apprehension. I remember as soon as we got there, I was like, there's no way they're talking about mental health in the form of the spirit and Jin Baba and whatever. And, you know, and I thought I had that was my initial reaction, was like, oh my God, they don't know any better. They're so miseducated. They don't know anything. This is mental health. Like, it's not a mandir. Like, it's not something you would go to a mandir to fix kind of thing. And I think that experience overall just like humbled me so much.
Yeah.
Because I almost felt like after that day, I think I almost felt like, who are we to say how someone is feeling or to put them into a certain definition that we have held? Like, that is so unfair to that person or that cultural context. And I think my classmates that obviously grew up in America have a very, very Western ideal of thinking. They continue to carry that. I think I still had a little bit of like, okay, maybe this would work, or maybe like I was a little bit open-minded to hearing them out, because I knew, okay, clearly it is helping, right? But I think my two classmates initially, they were like, this is so bogus. This is so BS. There's no way this actually works for real people. Like, this would never work in the US. And that's kind of the things that they were comparing while they were in Delhi. Was a lot of it was like, would this work in the US? And if the answer was yes or no, that kind of dictated their reaction to it, because they were conditioned to knowing what things work and what things don't work here in the US. And they are right, you know, like if a practice like that was held up in the US, like I don't think it would be very widely received. Whether or not correct or not, that's another thing. But would it be socially acceptable? Probably not. And I think that's the mentality they were going with, versus like me and my friend who were both like from India, we kind of had this like, okay, maybe it does work, like maybe it makes sense that someone would want to go to a religious place of worship because they would rather do that and rather resort to those kinds of practices than going to a therapist, because we understand the cultural stigma around that, whereas my classmates didn't.
And, also the cultural stigma around talk therapy too for our community is a lot of the generations through colonization were taught to suppress. And so there wasn't a whole lot of talking. And so by the time we get to our parents and the next generation, it's hard to break, because sometimes you don't even realize what you need to break, or when this has just been the norm is like, we don't really talk. Our community shows love in lots of different actions, food and collective gathering, all those kinds of things. But apart from that, I think sometimes we wonder, why don't you just go to talk therapy? And I think when we start to look into that, we can kind of connect the dots to, okay, this is historical. And so we also have to look at what's worked along the way, and music, dance, all these kinds of things that our community has embraced over centuries has been a huge part of healing as well. And so I think your experience, like just me learning about it, is opening a lot of doors and also providing a lot of relief even for me about, sometimes I wonder too, like, is this too much to think? Why can't we do it that way? It's even simple things like in North America, we're so much about consents. You have to have consents and sign consents. And a lot of times you have immigrants or people that don't understand consents, and it's scary because they put this before you and people are signing documents and have no clue because someone across the table is explaining words to them that they don't understand. And then you have the BIPOC community trying to change these consents into different languages to help, and they won't do it for whatever reason. And so even something so simple, you go to the hospital for that kind of treatment and you have no idea what's about to happen. And somehow that we're okay with, but then asking and being curious of the person's, community, and accepting that this is one way of relieving that kind of pain if it's schizophrenia or whatever sort of disorder. So what else did you come out understanding, or what kind of tools did you bring back to North America that you feel have added to your practice?
I think you mentioned this, but I want to go into psychiatry, and I'm an aspiring physician. And I think a lot of these things really resonated with me in terms of what kind of doctor I want to be when I do pursue that path, and how I would want to make a change in healthcare, in the mental health world, knowing all of this. And I think one of the biggest things that stood out to me was I myself, and I think people that want to pursue these kinds of careers, have a lot of unlearning to do. And I think it's really important to not think that you know it all, right? Like you mentioned, especially when therapists like have their degrees, and that's almost like a certification that they know all the knowledge they need to pursue their path. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that like the best way that we can learn how to be better people is to learn from people. That's kind of one of my main goals, I would hope, as someone that wants to be a psychiatrist, is I really want to take the time and the effort and the intentionality to learn from those people that I'm serving. And rather than trying to tell them what's correct or incorrect about their experience, really being open. And if that means that I have to alter the way that I think about their treatment or their symptoms, then so be it. I would rather change myself and expand my knowledge than have them change or alter their experience for the comfort of Western medicine. And I think another really big thing that stood out to me was in India, we actually visited AIMS, which I'm sure you've heard of. It's All India Medical Hospital. It's one of the biggest hospital chains across India. And so we visited the AIMS hospital in Delhi, and we actually spoke to a psychiatrist. And this is where I was the most interested, because I'm like, wow, I'm going to visit like an Indian psychiatrist. Like I really want to, I want to be him. And after talking to him, honestly, I was so disappointed, Kieran. Like, I can't even tell you. Initially, I was like, wow, a psychiatrist in India. Like, I bet he's doing so much for people's mental health. And honestly, the first 10 minutes of the conversation, I was just like let down over and over again.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest things he said was, in Delhi specifically, we have one psychiatrist to almost 10,000 people. And that is so heartbreaking. And so when we would talk to him about like, okay, how do you go about treating your patients, or what's your day-to-day experience like? He was like, honestly, I probably see patients for about 10 to 15 minutes, and I'll write them a medication and send them home, and that's it. And a lot of those patients don't return because they were already scared of going to the psychiatrist, and, you know, they got this medicine prescribed to them and they're like, okay, that's all we need. And that going there initially was already too much for them, and they would not want to return again. So they kind of take that medication and leave, and they do what they can with it. It was so disheartening to see that he was okay with it. Like, this was a practice that he was like actively condoning. But at the same time, it's like, what else can he do? You know, if there's so many people to serve and not that much time, even you as a physician, you have your own limitations. But I think just speaking to him really showed me that there's a lot of things we need to do better. In India and here, like, I think the biggest thing is really, really taking the time to unlearn what we think we know and being open to learning from people, because no one knows their experience better than they do. And who are we to validate that or explain to them? Like, it's almost like a form of mansplaining, but like in the mental health context, like, who are we to tell them that, like, oh, the symptoms you're describing to me are da 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 da. And maybe it's not. And maybe they need a different approach. Maybe they need first of all, they just need their feelings to be validated. And their approach needs to be a lot different than how we approach white folks' mental health.
It's so interesting when you say that, because I remember when I was working where I was working, we would do this thing called rounds consultations, which you would do at the hospital. And I think towards the end, before I left, I started to wonder and then ask, how come we don't have the family or the client there? Like, we're all trying to scramble and get information, and everyone has a different level of expertise, and the client's comfort will determine how much information you're going to get from them. If they trust you, they might give you more, maybe. But we assume, and how we ask and all these kinds of things. And we're talking for 45 minutes about a family or a client or whatever because we think we're family centered. And we're missing it because they're not here. And we're just deciding. And yet we think we are this family-centered facility, or we're really all about them. But the way we're going about it, because again, it's consents and worries. And it's like, how can we all be so worried when the people that we're talking about aren't in the room? And a big part of it is because we shift and we change. We talk very different when a patient or a client is not in the room versus when they are. And I think that right there is a sign of how much we think we know everything. And I think that's like, you know, when you say unlearn, sometimes I wonder, like, what does that mean? Because I'm on my own journey unlearning, and sometimes I'm like, am I doing this? Like, for you, how would you know if you were in a place and you were unlearning so that you can be more open and present for you know, our community? What would be one thing at least that you could think of?
I would definitely give myself grace. I know I'm bound to make mistakes, especially in the unlearning process, because I'm so conditioned to thinking the way that I've been thinking. And so we are going to make mistakes when we approach people and talk about their experiences. But I think the biggest thing I would take away with the unlearning is really being intentional about it, and making sure that, like, our intentions are clear to the person we're speaking to. I think people are a lot more gracious with you making mistakes with them if they know that, you know, their intention behind it was pure, that they meant to actually understand you. And that really opens up an active conversation versus it being like, I said something to you, you didn't understand, and I didn't care to correct you kind of thing, because you have this mentality that, like, you know it. Right. And that can make someone, like a patient, or that can make like a client, really apprehensive of further elaborating what they want to say, versus if you're like, hey, sorry, I guess I misunderstood you, right? And opening that conversation up, like, okay, what you're telling me and what I'm understanding is not overlapping. Let's go back. Let me start over. You tell me your experience again, maybe in a different light or in a different form, and really being open to that dialogue, like open dialogue. I think especially within mental health and healthcare specifically, I think a lot of patients are afraid to correct their physicians, to correct their mental health professionals. Like, once they say, like, I'm hearing you're feeling this and this and this. And in their head, they're probably thinking, not quite, but like, okay.
Yeah.
And I think they're really apprehensive of like, no, like, this is how I'm feeling. And part of it is because of the fear that they hold. But then a really big part of it is how the person addresses what they're hearing. If I tell you, yeah, I think you're feeling this, if I'm being very assertive about that, you're not going to feel like correcting me, or you're not going to want to even try and change my perspective, versus saying, I think that this is what you might be feeling, or I hear that you're feeling. That's opening the conversation for them to be like, not quite, or yeah, that is what I'm feeling. And I think that's a really big part of unlearning, is that open dialogue and them knowing that you're willing to take a few steps back and start over again.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about that, I think of little kids that start therapy at such a young age, and how easy it is to tell them what it is that they're thinking and feeling, and putting a conversation in a way that is really backing them into a corner, that they're like, yes, of course, that's what it is. I don't know what to say. And we do talk therapy with kids all the time, and we assume all sorts of things with them all the time too. And those kids grow up, and some of them may stay in the system, or some of them may continue to get support, whatever it is. And I remember having clients, and we're like, oh my God, they are so talk therapized because they know exactly what to say. Therapy's not supposed to be this box we all sit in, but often it feels like this menu of checklists. And when you're a client that's been receiving services for all your life, you learn how to respond to those things. And yeah, you're not really getting the real version, because like you said, it's easier this way, and you're misunderstood. And I think another part to this unlearning journey is when we're working with, especially the BIPOC community, and maybe we can really only speak to like our South Asian community, we're such a collective care community. It's not just my individual problem. My problem is connected to my whole household. And we don't factor in often enough what it would mean. You know, I remember talking to a friend who was doing therapy with someone from a different race, and they were teaching this young woman some boundaries. It was a mother-daughter dynamic. And the client was receiving a lot of strategies, because of the big B word, to put boundaries in place. And I couldn't help but wonder what it was like for that mom, because that mom didn't get that kind of help and support, and they're going to go back into this household, and maybe this young woman will have the bravery to speak up to her mother and what that would be like. But any of us that have done that, we know what happens when our moms aren't ready to have that boundary. And it's not to say that we don't need it. It's not necessary. It's just that a lot of people think all of our cultures are just like Western people's, because we've had to adapt, and some of us have had to assimilate. And so I might show up for therapy, and someone might think, oh, this chick is so Western. Okay, put a boundary in place. But no context about really how that's going to impact not just my mom, but my father, my siblings. And also, I'm the oldest brown girl in my household. Like, we don't look at hierarchy either at all when we're talking to families. And so I sometimes wonder, like, what the hell are we doing when we're these mental health professionals trying to help? And I think a lot of mental health professionals really like their ego stroke. They love hearing good feedback from their clients. They love, I did so good in therapy today. But like you said, sometimes we just feed them what they feed them, and we all go home and, we don't have a difference. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or anything sticks out for you.
Yeah, I think two things that I thought of. I think one of the things you were giving the example of like kids, right? And I, like, aside from psychology, I was also a human development major, and we have like a practicum, or like an externship kind of thing we do for 1 quarter, where you go into like a real world scenario where you interact with kids in some shape or form. The externship I did, where I worked at a early learning center at Davis, and I worked with kids that were like a year to 3 years old. And it was really interesting because their approach to education is really different, because since they're affiliated through the university, they're very like research focused about what kinds of theories and things help kids the most with their development. And I just remember my experience there kind of applied to almost everything, even though it was like about little kids. But I think one of the biggest things they taught us is don't tell the kid what you're observing or what you think something is. And so a lot of that kind of took place in like when they were playing in their playrooms. And we were told not to tell them what an object is. So if they're playing with a car, we would just say what we observed, but we wouldn't call it a car to them. So, you know, however they wanted to use it is how they would use it. And I remember this one kid, initially when I was new to the program, obviously I was still practicing like that terminology, but he was playing with some car structure or something. And I was like, wow, that's a nice car you got there. And he like snaps at me really sassy. And he's like, no, this isn't a car. This is my flying mermaid. And just for a second, I was like, no, it's not. It's a car. But then our advisor was like, no, you let them think of whatever they want to think of. Like, you don't have to tell them what the object is.
Yeah.
And if they want to use a car as a flying mermaid, then so be it. And you support that and you say, wow, where is this mermaid going? Like, does this mermaid swim underwater, in the air? And that really played a very crucial example for definitions and like context. And I think like what we apply to children in that sense could be applied to therapy. It could be applied in healthcare. And it's really about letting them call it what it is, right? And like the more that we say, oh, that's a car, it's almost like you mentioned, at every therapy appointment they go to, they're going to think that a car is a car. Versus if they had the free space to be able to think what they want, maybe they would have thought of it as a flying mermaid. But because they were so conditioned to someone else telling them that it's a car, that's what they're going to think. And I think like that example just clicked right now.
Yeah.
While we're speaking. I don't think I've ever thought of that before, but now I'm thinking of it and I'm like, damn, that's a really good example of how therapy can be so valuable, but also so hindering, because the more a therapist tells you what certain things are supposed to be, like you mentioned, every appointment, they're going to think of a response that correlates to what their therapist wants to hear from them.
Totally.
You know, and that really like limits their conversation and their introspectiveness about their own feelings.
It's a really good example, because I think when we think of this conditioning term, I think of our moms sitting at therapy, or our grandmas, grandpas, dads, and again, all this historical context, and they've been conditioned and don't really understand too, from the generations and generations of all of that trauma that anyone that came from India had to endure. And I think when we're now here in Canada and sitting at the therapist chair, and let's say it's my mom and she's upset about something, we're only going to address whatever's happening right before, because we're not even recognizing as a therapist that this person may be conditioned to think in the way that they've had to think, or they don't have, again, the vocabulary, or they're calling it a problem. You know, sometimes I would try to translate in Punjabi when I was counseling, and we don't have words in the same way. And so you're trying to think about, you know, like punish. I always think about, we were always about positive and negative consequences, and our community is punishment. But then that was like a red flag to call children's services or whatever, because, oh my gosh, they punish. And it's like, no, that's not what's happening here. Let's break it down. But I just think sometimes, like you said, the conditioning that happens even prior to, you know, for our elders and from the generational trauma that they don't even know they may have experienced, and a therapist isn't equipped to understand that. It might just think, oh yeah, the problem is you need to put a boundary up with your daughter, you know, and my mom's going to walk out thinking, oh, what the hell? And maybe not even understand why she needs a boundary with her daughter, all these other things that might have happened. And that's the part that I really worry about, because I've been in there. Again, I'm not a therapist, but I've seen it. I've done work to know that there is so much work that those of us that are mental health practitioners have to hold accountability to, if we're going to say we're going to provide this service to a child or a family or an individual. So as we're talking, you know, we've kind of said this, but the mental field in North America is overwhelmingly white. Like, whether they're white people or they are people like me who were the oppressed, following the, you know, continuing to oppress and continuing to sort of push the Western sort of philosophies. And so what do you think are the consequences of this to the BIPOC clients that people need to learn from or understand?
I really experienced this in India and saw it. And I think we've grown up in the US, like people like us have, like when they immigrated, they've been in North America for a really long time. So they've almost like assimilated to that Western culture. And we sometimes forget that our people get left behind, even though we are continuing to assimilate. And whenever we interact with them again, it's like almost like a time difference. I feel like people in India are almost frozen in time, and I'm here like developing my mentality and, continuing to conform to Western culture, that whenever I go back, it's almost like a culture shock over and over again, because these people are thinking the same way that they always have, but I'm trying to take my advanced learning to their, like, oh, it's not stagnant, but it's like, it's similar. They've been progressing at a very similar rate. And I think that's really important and a little damaging, honestly, to the BIPOC communities we serve now, because even as people that might come from the same culture, it's over time as we assimilate to the white narrative, we almost expect everyone else to continue adapting and assimilating at a similar rate. And it's not always true, and that's not always how things are going to go. And so I think the more that we continue to learn and we continue to grow and adapt to the white environment that we are, I think it's really important to continue going back and taking space for talking to our relatives, talking to our older folks, especially, because I know like the younger generation, we're all about change and we're all about like progressive movement. But I think while that's really important, it's like we want to make sure that what we're pushing for and fighting for still resonates with our communities that might be left behind. And it's like figuring out a way that as we grow, going back and bringing them with us, rather than us growing to a point so much where there's a really big dissonance between a white assimilated cultural immigrants versus like newly immigrants or like people back in India, like really, really bridging those two gaps together.
So some of what we're kind of talking about is this buzzword that's going around, but I don't know if it's buzzword because I don't think we've said it enough, but this whole decolonizing mentality that we all need to work on. And is there any kind of conversation in your schooling, or maybe even you in your community, or maybe just you individually are thinking of and having when we think about decolonizing mental health? Like, what would that look like in everyday life? Is that something that comes up in the academics, or at least for you?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I think for a research psychology class, we got to pick a topic we wanted to write about in improving mental health practices in the US. And my topic for my research paper was actually decolonizing mental health.
Oh.
So it's funny that you talk about that. And I think the biggest thing that I talked about in my paper and that I read through the research I did was implementing a lot of non-traditional practices here in the US and using that as an alternative to Western medicine or Western therapy. And a really big one I remember reading about, obviously there wasn't a lot of studies on this, so the research in that department was really scarce. So I had to write a 12-page research paper with very limited actually published research about this topic. But one of the few things I found was people using Reiki and healing and chakra meditation, which is very, very commonly practiced in Ayurvedic medicine, and implementing that here in the US and actually using Reiki and spiritual healing practices to treat mental health or to treat medical problems. And I think when we talk about decolonizing mental health or just decolonizing healthcare in general, a lot of it comes from bringing in practices from all over the world. And a really big part of it is realizing that Western practices are not always going to be correct and not always going to work for everyone. And that is kind of the key of decolonization. Is I think when people come here and come to North America, we have this I think it stems from a lot of xenophobia, where it's we are correct and everyone else is wrong and change is bad and this is the way things have been. And I think when people talk about how mental health is colonized, it's because we're believed to think that the Western is correct and everything else is incorrect. And so when we talk about decolonization, it's bringing those narratives that for time and time again we've been told are inaccurate, incorrect, not representative, like bringing those practices back into the Western fields and using that and proving that like these are actual alternatives that have worked for people back home for multiple years. And they're not incorrect, they're not inaccurate. It's just that the Western hasn't allowed any space for them to be formally researched, to be even accredited by any like medical mental health associations. And it's like, just because it hasn't been accredited or studied enough doesn't mean it's incorrect. It's your fault in not studying it, you know? I think it's funny how like a lot of Ayurvedic practices are deemed like incorrect and inaccurate when they've been doing it for millions of years. Like Ayurvedic medicine is one of the oldest medicine practices in the world. And to deem that as inaccurate when it's been helping millions is so bizarre to me.
But that's also a contradiction because at the same time, how many people are repackaging that and selling it back to us? I mean, give us our yoga back. Like give us all of the mind and body practice back. Give us all of that back, because on one hand, there's not enough science to show that it'll work, as you're saying. But then on the other hand, it's only the Western people that open these studios and do these things that are not done accurately, are not done with the credit where it's given. And this is where I really, really feel for Indigenous communities, because like we're on their land and every day they have to see us do the things we do and not giving them the credit that they should have. And I love what you're saying. I always say like these conversations are us building our research, our own data. Like, how do we push that out more? Because those practices from generations and generations, just like you said, have been such a big part of our community, and it's been torn apart. And yet there's so much relief. And if we were to collect the stats, we would see there's like good number of people that feel they are healing. And if anything, it's like faith-based. Lots of things are bringing people close to the roots and where we come from. But so many of us are so detached from that, because even people that look like you and I will say, oh my God, that's just horse shit. That's bullshit. Like, that's just fake. And I think we can only start with ourselves. Like, we have to also step it up now too and say, okay, enough of that. One thing you spoke so well about was, if you think of your own mom or your grandma, like, a lot of these Western mental health practices are breaking our family homes and our collective care because they're very individual and not so much of everyone else. And so I remember fighting with my mom back in the day when I was one day in mental health school. And that was really difficult for the two of us, because maybe my mom could have used a counselor, but the way that I knew everything got in the way of me maybe being able to be a really good support for her at that time. And so I really liked how you spoke. We have to be able to look at, our ancestors. We have to look at our grandparents or elders and work with them, because they have things that really do work and we don't know better. Can you speak to that more? Because it was just so well said.
I don't want to entirely discredit Western medicine. I think a lot of what it's taught us has been valuable, but I think like what I say when our generation is going to be the ones to make a change, I think it's like now we have all of these tools and we've learned so much through formal education. Like, we have opportunities and privilege that our ancestors didn't have. And I think when it comes to like using that for good, is that really comes with like, okay, here's all the knowledge that I've accumulated, and here's the privilege I have to exist in a society where I can call things out freely without my safety being like threatened. And I think like we have such an advantage in that aspect, and we live in a world that's so much more accepting of us and our ideas, that now it's our turn to be like, okay, well, this was so historically not accepted. And I think it's almost our job to use our privilege and like call attention to those topics, call attention to those people, those cultures, those practices that, for so long have been deemed incorrect or inaccurate. And I think a really important part, like I mentioned, is balance, right? And I think it's very easy to get swept away. And I think I've done it too. So I share that with you. You know, when we talk to our parents about mental health, we're always like, well, this is what I think is wrong with you, or this is what I think you should do, right? And like I have told my parents a couple of times where I've been like, you know, I think you have this, or I think you have this, and like maybe you guys should go to therapy. We need to learn about boundaries, and like not realizing that, you know, sure, maybe those things can help, but in a constructive method, right? In like really approaching those things as a way that could help them. And before introducing them to the topic of therapy, which may be so daunting and intimidating for a lot of Desi parents, like initiating that conversation ourselves and maybe like almost giving them like a pre-therapy and being open to talking to them about problems without telling them what those problems are or what we think they are. And that's kind of where the balance comes from, is while we're using our background context and knowledge and privilege to help further them into getting more access to mental health care, like telling them that therapy is okay, bringing that conversation around like mental health stigma. Those are all really important and progressive and good things. But at the end of the day, it's also just equally as important to go back in time and recognize and be aware of the fact that like this is how they've been doing things. And for some people it's worked, and for some people it hasn't. And if it hasn't, then we are going to be the people that like give them tools. And rather than telling them what to do, it's like, well, here's something you might have not known about, you know? And we kind of like engage in an active conversation and where we're learning from each other, rather than I'm telling my parents what to do, or I'm telling BIPOC communities that they should feel this way, versus here's what we know, and this is what you've been practicing for multiple years. Let's put them together and figure out a new solution or a new method that helps both of us feel validated.
Yeah, like how do you bring in your faith as well as some talk therapy or whatever kind of Western philosophies that could help? And you had made a really good point before too about like teaching and helping our elders, our parents, our family members, our community understand where the line is. So that, sure, faith and religion and going to the Gurdwara can be very meditative, can be really helpful, but how can I understand where it won't be helpful? And again, everyone has to look at that on their own terms, because everyone has a different line in the sand. And I really appreciated you saying that, because I'm like, that's just what it is where is that line for all of us, where even going to talk therapy is great, but what point does it not work? And again, where does action happen? Because I think sometimes we get caught in that. We talk, but then what am I doing to actively make that change or whatever it is I need to do? And so for you, like, how would you suggest to people listening today or viewing, if we have community members that we're worried about and we want to be respectful of them maybe believing and doing the faith-based practices, but maybe we feel like they could use a different kind of support or whatnot. How can we help those people in our community understand where their line is so they can make the best decision for them?
With that, we refer back to those priests in India that are doing this, right? And like maybe learn from them and take that knowledge from them. Is like in these religious institutions and practices, like people are being trained in that mental health field, and they're being taught mental health vocabulary, like they're being taught symptoms to look out for. And I think that can be really empowering, because while they're in those religious spaces, if you know a priest or a religious like community member or community leader recognizes that like, hey, this person comes to my temple every day, or I've seen them around at like religious gatherings, and I know that like they are very religious, very dedicated to their faith, but I know that maybe they need an additional support, that they be the people to kind of bring that conversation forward. And especially because it's very hard for people in our community to go out and seek that help and resources themselves, versus if they hear it from someone that's part of what they're actively engaging in. Like if they go to the temple every day, they're more likely to take their priest or someone from their temple very seriously about their mental health, compared to if a psychiatrist like did a consult with them and was like, you need to take this medication, right? Versus if a priest is telling you that, you almost feel that connection with them, that they are probably equally as devoted or religious as me. But if they're thinking that I need extra support, then like they would be more likely to take that seriously. And that's why we've seen that it's been working in Gujarat and back home in India is priests are being aware of this like mental health symptoms, and they know where the fine line is. And I think they're really good at recognizing that now, is when people can lean towards faith versus when it needs a little bit more corrective action from like other mechanisms, and recognizing that that's okay. It's okay that, you know, you did what you could in your own way, and here's a little bit more to like support you. It doesn't mean that what you're currently doing isn't working. It's not to discredit their faith or their dedication to their religion. It's just to provide them extra support.
Yeah.
And I think like when that conversation comes from the community or from the religion itself, it's a lot more impactful versus someone just telling them that they need extra support.
I feel like when I hear you say that, I think of a midwife or a doula, and then a doctor. There's only so far. They have lines. A doula, midwife, they have lines. They know how far they can take their clients, and then they're like, oh, now we need a doctor. Can you imagine if we had at the Gurdwara less politicians coming in and talking their crap at us, and having more young people or community members that we find trustworthy to talk about mental health and religion together? Like I would way rather listen to a 10-minute conversation at someone's wedding about that real what's happening in the real world than, you know, politicians. When there's a safe space, it's even when we get together at a community gathering or with our friends at the table, when there's a safe space, we know what happens when we have the kind of, like, even think about your mom at the beginning of the conversation, and sort of that is one way of practicing really good mental health. Finding something that you love and role modeling that, and you have a bunch of community members, other women that are like, oh my gosh, if I can do this for myself, I'm going to be a way better mom, way better wife, way better whatever it is I have to do. How do we take care of ourselves and put this little boundary in place, but do it in a way that isn't taking away from the one thing that we're so good at, which is collective care? It's like a double-edged sword in some ways.
I think one of the biggest problems we see when creating boundaries is kind of like the example that you mentioned. It's like the contrast between like a collective community versus individualistic, right? And like the whole idea of boundaries stems from very individualistic communities where it's, I can shut my door and like my parents have to knock before coming in, and you know, I'm allowed to go out whenever I want because I'm 18 and I can have a say in what I do. And if you told that to an Indian kid, they're like, well, my mom doesn't let me be out after 8 p.m. Like, I'm at home and I'm not allowed to close my door. I can't lock it. Like, and that's kind of where we see that shift, is between like collective communities and individualistic communities. And when we talk about boundaries, sometimes we resort to thinking like boundaries means that you're following that individualistic culture. And I think like a really big thing that I've learned is that setting boundaries doesn't mean, especially how we address it to our parents, it doesn't mean that screw you guys, like I want to be my own person and I don't care about anyone else. I think that's kind of what parents hear when we're talking about boundaries, versus like, I want you guys to be there and support me while I have the space to grow on my own. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of like the conversation that needs to be had around boundaries with our parents, because when they see it the other way, they're thinking, oh, my kid just wants to like leave. My kid wants to be like a pariah. They're not going to have any sense of like culture. They're not going to have any sense of like what's right and what's wrong. And I think that's like a really big thing I discovered when moving out of state to go to college, is seeing how much trust and faith like my parents had in me to be able to make the right decisions when I was literally living on my own in a new state for the first time. And my parents had, whether they call it boundaries or not, I think they had a really good understanding of what boundaries mean. Is they weren't helicopter parents when I was away. They really let me have the space to make mistakes, to be my own person, to figure my shit out while I was alone. But they knew that they had instilled enough values and morals in me to know that like I would always come back to where I came from, right? And I think they knew that just as much as I did. And that's why like when I was away, I felt more okay to make mistakes, because I was like, you know what? Fine, I messed up, but I know I have that like recall to be like, it's okay. Like I know where I'm centered at. And I think that's a really big part of boundaries as well, is knowing how far you can go before you've gone too far from who you are or how you identify in your culture. I think a lot of times parents see, or just our older community sees boundaries as going too far, but I don't think that they give us enough trust to know that, like, hey, I can go out of this bubble a little bit, but I still know, like, where I come from. I still have respect for my community, my collectivist culture, but I also want to explore that individualistic side of me. And I think that's kind of where setting boundaries in our communities should be really emphasized, is both a collectivist and individualistic culture rather than just the individual.
One. Yeah, I love that. I think that's well said. Really well said. So anything that you want to add further with the reconnecting with our roots?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing that kind of sums up everything, there's a fine line between the Western culture and our traditional culture. But I think a really big part of undoing that and decolonizing and learning what works for us is being okay to mesh the two together in whatever form works for us. And maybe for some, that means like 90% Western culture and remaining that 10% within our roots, or it's a 50-50 split for some. And I think it's okay to explore that. And for me personally, over time, mine started probably as like 90-10, right? And as I was growing up, I was so forced to assimilate that, like, in middle school, up till middle school, I was very like 90% Western, wanting to be like into the white culture a lot more. And then growing up, that percentage kind of like shifted, and my line kind of shifted to wanting to explore that, like, my Desi side more, my South Asian roots and culture more, especially like while going to school for psychology, kind of like finding that balance again. And I think it's okay to give ourselves the time and space to grow and to shift that balance from one or the other, however we see fit. And to not want to put ourselves or our mental health or anything in a box of, okay, well, I'm too whitewashed, or I'm too desi, or I'm, this or that. And I think it's okay to have that like middle space and the awkward space, and giving ourselves grace to figure it out.
As you're talking, I'm like, this is so cool. Like, you and I have 22 years age gap. And I think when we really open our hearts, like, we can really learn from each other. And sometimes we miss out on that because of ageism or sexism, all that stuff. And I think there's so much knowledge at every sort of stage. And when we have these conversations, we give and we take. And at the end of the day, like, what's our big picture? It's ensuring that our community, what our ancestors fought for, doesn't just disintegrate. It doesn't just disappear. We don't lose our language. We don't lose all of these customs that our elders have fought so hard for. And I love hearing how you talk about giving ourselves that grace and that balance. And honestly, we always find our way back. It took me a lot longer in my 40s to start to do more of that. I think somehow we find our way back, and sometimes it's a life-changing trip. Sometimes it's a conversation, sometimes it's journaling, whatever it is. I think it's when we give ourselves some space and time to just figure out, where am I, who am I, what am I doing, that reflective thing. It's amazing how much of our core memories and our experiences come from our parents and our elders and our aunts and uncles and all these cousins and people that we had the privilege to being around and growing up with. I'd like to kind of ask you too, a call to action maybe for therapists. What can they actually be doing outside of the Western mental health to learn more? Because at the end of the day, we do need these therapists. Who doesn't matter who they are, what color they are. We just want you guys to understand every single person in the best way possible, and not just from a small little lens of them sitting there. So what would you suggest for those that are viewing that have stuck through this whole conversation without getting defensive? What can they do to push some of those beliefs and norms and challenge them?
I think the first thing is the fact that, if people are able to recognize that there's a gap in their practice and what their clients are needing or wanting, that itself is a really big deal. And we're proud of all of our white therapists for being culturally aware and like wanting to take that extra step of being culturally competent. And like, I just want to applaud them for that. But I think it's always going to be a constant learning journey. I think the biggest thing I would tell them is to really be person first rather than treatment first. And really taking into account someone's stories, someone's experiences, always keeping that in the back of their mind, thinking what other factors or what parts of their culture, their lives could really be impacting the way that they feel. I think a lot of the way that people provide care, also, whether we like it or not, underlyingly comes from our personal beliefs and our personal experiences. And whether we like it or not, like those personal beliefs trickle into our practices as well. And so I think like really opening yourself out, not as a therapist, but as a person, and, you know, engaging with these communities, like going to spaces where there's a lot of BIPOC folks, like interacting, making friends with Black and brown people, and really, really understanding and immersing yourself in their culture. Where do they come from? I think if any white person spent like a whole day with an Indian family, they would, so many things would start clicking, like, oh, this is why they feel that way, or this is why they act that way. And I think that comes with a lot of personal development. And so as much as we want to grow as professionals, I think it also comes down to you being an open and reflective person and like really being intentional about the communities and the space that you surround yourself with. And those kinds of subconscious learnings that you take from being around BIPOC folks will also hopefully start to trickle into your practices and making you a more culturally competent individual in your practice as well.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I'd like to add too, because if some are listening and think, oh yeah, I have a best friend that's brown or whatever, I think even challenging that further, because I've been that best friend that's brown to many of these white people. And like I keep saying, the oppressed also oppress. And so sometimes they have a fake version of who I am because they only see this Western side. And I've got caught into being, you know, part of these microaggressions where they'll ask certain things and these stereotypes. And to be honest, never have had any of my white friends really wanted with me learn about my history and understand where a lot of this comes from. And so sometimes when I talk about the trauma and intergenerational trauma, or even me learning about the partition, it's interesting because it really is a token relationship. Sometimes it's, well, I got to wear your outfits, I got to eat your food, I got to hang out with your mom and dad, and so that tells me that I know everything. But I would say push that even more, because your brown or Black or Asian best friend may also be working through their own journey and trying to unlearn a lot of that Western stuff too. If any of those folks are listening too, because I feel like I become their badge, and I wish I could go back to some of those conversations and have them again, knowing what I know now and feel what I know. I would encourage that too, because I think sometimes it's a hoax when they say, well, my best friend is brown, and yet they're throwing 20 microaggressions at me at the same time. So just adding a little PSA from personal experiences of conversations not going well. And what about to our community? As we keep saying, some of us continue to oppress. So to some of us, what would you suggest a call to action for our own community?
I think one thing I really needed to hear a few years ago is that you're on the right path. And however you navigate your cultural identity, however you navigate the space you're in is your experience, and it's a valid one, you know? And if you have been struggling with really being whitewashed, coming from an environment maybe where your culture wasn't that accepted, or you kind of lost touch with your culture for whatever reason, like you are living and breathing proof that like you can always bring back your culture. You are it. You are your culture, you know? So if you ever feel like you're not connected to it, or you feel distanced, or you feel like you've changed yourself way too much to where you've lost touch with that side of yourself, like always remind yourself that it's within you. And it comes from with a lot of soul searching, but I think it's really empowering to know that our community is so welcoming, and whenever we want to go back to it, it'll welcome us with open arms. It's kind of funny, like whenever I go back to India, like it leaves me feeling so refreshed, because it's like they never treat me as like, oh, well, she went abroad and she thinks she knows everything and she's all like, a big hi-fi, like whitewashed girl now. It's always like, oh, like my beta is back, or like my kiddo is back, and we're always welcomed with that like open heart, open mind. And I think that like we should give ourselves the permission to be like that too, and to know that whatever spaces we're navigating, like one, we'll figure it out, and there's tools everywhere to help us, there's our people to help us, and two, like wherever you are, you'll find your way. Like you are the path to who you want to become.
Aw, that's so well said. And you're so accurate about our community and how open and inviting always they are. And I feel that has helped me on so many levels on this little journey that I've been on too, is from my parents, my siblings, my relatives. So many family members are like, hey, don't lose sight of it all. You can't forget this part. Remember, this is who you are, and this is how much you're loved. And it's like, oh yeah, because sometimes you feel very guilty and feel like I'm a terrible community member. And what's interesting is our community will always welcome back, but some of these white friends along the way that I've pushed back with, it's done. There is no welcoming back. And I think that is very much of that me mentality and being in this, compartmentalizing that individual approach versus how much our community thrives when they're like, we're not losing each other. We need more of us. So come on down. So I think that's a really important point for anyone that is listening or viewing today, is like, yeah, man, we're solid with the kind of community we come from. If you could rebuild therapy from scratch, blending Western and South Asian wisdom, like what would that look like for you?
That is a very loaded question. Like I feel like there's so much I could think of for that. But I think I would hope that everyone that's going to school for some kind of like mental health profession is given an opportunity to maybe not even study abroad, but like basically do the course I did and really, really take the time to immerse themselves in that specific culture. And as therapists, like it makes sense that you want to serve a wide variety of people, and that you won't be able to cover every single culture and go in depth and really do all of that. But I think it's like the effort of even trying and taking, like, I wish, like, honestly, if people went to school for psychology to become a therapist, I wish that this was more informal curriculum where literally every week was a different culture and you spent the entire week learning about cultural practices to serve mental health within those communities. And I think that would be so cool. And if it was like an 8-week long course, some people spend 2 to 3 years doing that program. Imagine if each week was a different culture, how many communities you could cover, and like really, really like have taken the intentional time to learn about them and how that would impact their practice. If I were to just blanket statement, if that's one thing I would do to build it from the ground up, would be that is 1 week per culture, and you cover like the very, very important nitty gritty things of each community. And at the end of the course, you kind of like accumulate a mosaic of all these different cultures and communities and learn how to put them together in the context of mental health.
That's really, yeah, maybe one day they'll give up Freud and they'll throw some of that in, because I think that's so valid and so important. Absolutely. I want to go and do the course that you did in Delhi. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I think it's very well said how you said that. I would take that course if you did it that way too. Okay, so is there anything that you wish I had asked you today that maybe I didn't, or you want to go back and sort of recover or add to, clarify?
Not really. I think we touched on a lot of different things, and overall, like wrapping up, they kind of all fit together somehow, some way.
When you go back to when you reached out and really wanted this conversation between you and I, this is your episode. So if you go back to even that, is there anything in there that you wish that you could have said? I mean, you can always come back again, so don't feel like you got to do it all at one too. But I just want to make sure that we honor what it is that you wanted to share today too.
I think another part of what I wanted to share was my personal experience with religion and mental health, and kind of reconnecting that back to like our traditional methods of mental health practice. I think being away in college in California, where there's a lot of Punjabis, the Punjabi community is very strong and tight knit. I think I like kind of rediscovered Sikhi a lot through our campus. Like I was fortunate enough to be surrounded by a lot of really good role models in the Sikh community. And I almost took religion as another way to kind of talk about mental health. And I think our Gurbani, which is our Sikh scripture, like talks a lot about mental health, whether we think of it or not. And I was a part of a student-run clinic that was dedicated to serving the Sikh community. And so every Sunday, we would actually go to the Gurdwara and provide them free mental health and health care. So we would do like basic vital signs. We would have a doctor there they could see. And it was really interesting to see like how this blend of Sikhi and like healthcare came to be and how we held space for those kinds of people. And I remember I was the social justice coordinator of our clinic and I was on board for that. And I think that's kind of one of the main things I wanted to do as a social justice coordinator is really bring the conversation of mental health and associating that with healthcare. And it was really cool to see that like a lot of what people talk about in the Gurdwara talk about mindfulness. A lot of our gurus say that like, you know, there's a famous quote that's in Sikh scriptures that says man jeete jag jeet, which means if you conquer your mind, you conquer the world. And I think like that is such a powerful thing that it literally is in our religion. And it's something that we've been studying and reading about for ages. And it connects so beautifully with our mental health because our religion is telling us that there is so much power to our mind, and you know, bringing peace and serenity to our mind can bring peace and serenity to the world around us. And so that was kind of one of the bigger things I wanted to mention too, is there's so many contrasts with religion and like specifically Sikhi and mental health. And I'm so fortunate to have learned and call myself a Sikh because I've learned these things and I'm able to take them and use them in my day-to-day life everywhere I go.
Sometimes it's hard for our community to admit that their religion is their coping strategy because so many of us have been like, what are you talking about? And so
Yeah.
I think this is a very validating conversation for so many of our community members and members from other communities too that are like, okay, I've told you guys all along, or yeah, that does help me. And you know, the balance of being aware, that self-awareness of like, this is helping me, but maybe I need something else too. I don't know. And I think you said it so well. What about middle fingers up? So we'll wrap up with that. So it's your opportunity to put your middle fingers up to something lighthearted, something a little bit more deep. What do you want to put your middle fingers up to today?
I think I want to put my middle finger up to the concept that change is bad and what we've been doing is correct the whole time, and undoing that kind of like very traditional mentality of this is the way things are and anything that's different than that is incorrect. And I think a lot of our Western society kind of holds that. And so middle fingers up to that and being open to change.
Yes, that's right. We are change. I agree. Well said. And then lastly, a call to action. So if everyone here were to take one thing and only one thing from your episode, what do you really hope they take today?
Is that you are powerful and that you have the power to bring change to others by bringing change to yourself.
Ooh, love it. Well said.
Yeah.
Well, Astha, funny story when we first talked, as I had said to you, you know, when we're talking about change, autocorrect is the worst. Your name kept autocorrecting to asthma, which I heard is what people address you as sometimes. So I just want to thank you, Astha, so much for reaching out. We always say these conversations are door openers. I know I said this earlier, but I will say it again. These are the conversations that we have all been hoping to have, don't know how to have. This is a space for it. This is not my platform. It's ours. So for those of you that listen, that view, you hear something, please reach out. Tell us what you thought about this conversation. We're just starting it. So this is why it's a door opener. Maybe you want to add to it, whatever it may be, please reach out. We want to thank you so much for your time. And where can people find you? If they want to find your blog or if they want to connect with you, where's the best place to reach you?
Yeah, so my blog is called The Essence of Self. So I have an Instagram page that I post on when I'm not busy with studying. And then my website is theessenceofself.com. So you all can check me out. My personal page is linked through my blog Instagram. So I would love for people to like reach out to me. I always love to like connect with new folks, just like you, Karen.
Yes.
We always want to, welcome new conversations, talk to more people, bridge the gap between our people all over the world. So, yeah, I would love to hear from you all.
That's amazing. That's great. Thank you again for your time.